Welcome back to yet another episode of your Re-Educated podcast. We are making good headway with season 10. I'm very excited for today's conversation. Today, we're talking to Michael Treadway. He is one of the leading voices in the neuroscience of motivation, effort-based decision-making, and affective disorders. He currently directs the Translational Research in Affective Disorders Laboratory, where he and his team investigate how brain systems governing motivation and reward are disrupted in mood and anxiety disorders. He is best known for his development of experimental paradigms that explore how psychiatric disorders, like depression and anxiety, alter the brain's reward and motivation systems. How are you doing today?
Doing great. It's a pleasure to be here.
Yeah, pleasure, huh? I mean, I think it's interesting because the first episode on the season we talked about, I talked to a philosopher about well-being and really kind of getting into what exactly does that look like? What does well-being mean? And it was fascinating how, as we spoke about that, it became so clear its deep, impact on education, on policy, and all these things, depending on how we define what a good life is. And a lot of the conversation was actually around pleasure. And so I feel like this
hmm
is a perfect continuation of that to really dive a little bit more deeply in it from a neuroscientific perspective and what exactly is that. But before we start, I want to kind of just get your own story and backstory on how you got interested with pleasure.
Yeah, I didn't start out as a neuroscientist. I was actually a music major in college, and music has always been one of the primary sources of pleasure I experience, particularly among, the various art forms. I am also someone who has, at various times in my life, struggled with depression and with a real difficulty experiencing pleasure. And I think that's really what, broadly speaking, set me on this career path is wanting to understand what is changing when I've had times where it felt very difficult to access pleasure and motivation and a sense of life being beautiful and meaningful. And what happened when that sense all came back. And so, broadly speaking, that's what got me got interested in this career.
Mm. I mean, I've done a fair amount of traveling, especially for the podcast. And one of the things that I find to be so fascinating is the amount different cultures differ on how much they place pleasure as like this really important value to aim for. And I think it's fascinating because how important you place pleasure seems to have a direct impact on how much of it you feel. And so I'm curious first, I guess, to start by first understanding when we use the word pleasure, what do we even mean?
Yeah, I think it's really important to define in the psychological and neuroscientific literature. It usually has a somewhat narrow meaning that's really about a relatively brief uh, and somewhat sensory experience, uh, you know, delicious food, the feeling of a really pleasant touch, including, sexual touch is often a hallmark of pleasure, and a section of a song or a piece of music that really uh, in evokes a strong sense of enjoyment. It can be a bit hard to define, but it's usually thought of in at least how we study it as a relatively ephemeral experience. And I think that's important because that's one of the key qualities that differentiates it from more lasting forms of well-being, which often we use words like a sense of contentment, maybe even a word like happiness, tends to imply a longer and more stable duration, whereas pleasure can be very punctate and fleeting.
Hmm. So, I mean, I have two interesting questions because I find the children's song, If You're Happy and You Know It, Clap Your Hands, to be a truly phenomenal, just human experience. Because one thing that I've never really understood is when we use one, I want to understand this from a neuroscientific perspective, and then also just from a layperson perspective of when we use a word like I'm feeling happy or I'm feeling pleasurable right now. I'm at I'm pleased. How do we know that what I'm referring to, my body sensation, is similar to what you're referring to when you use that same word?
Right. I mean, this is one of these old dilemmas that we often all learn about, around age 10 or 12 when we start to realize, hey, what I call the color brown, what I actually experience may be really different than what you experience. And we just both learned to call it the same thing, but is it phenomenologically the same thing? And we don't really have an answer. And uh, pleasure is a what philosophers of mind, an example of qualia, the sort of subjective experience of something that we don't necessarily have a way to equate across individuals. Um, I can do things like they do in classic economics of trying to figure out how different types of experiences rank for you in terms of your preferences. Like if uh, I give you apples versus oranges, what do you choose? Maybe you choose apples, and then I give you apples versus cake, what do you choose? And so forth. And I can have you make a series of choices and map out your relative preferences across all types of pleasurable experiences. But I still don't know, does your actual subjective experience, how does that compare in terms of its intensity for you versus someone else? And that's a core question in the philosophy of mind, a version of what philosopher David Chalmers refers to as the hard problem, which is the nature of qualia and subjective experience. That pleasure, as in other domains, we don't have great answers for.
And I guess that makes it so hard to study because if you were to say, on a scale of 1 to 10, how pleasurable do you feel? You could just be measuring completely different things among 5 or 10 people. And so then you'd have to look for particular regions of brains, I'm assuming, and then say that, okay, when this particular part lights up, then that's what we're going to call pleasure. And so is that how a neuroscientist would look at defining pleasure, for example?
Yes, I mean, one thing we do know is people tend to experience some stability in their range of pleasure. So by the time you're an adult, typically you have a good sense of, for you, what a 1 versus a 10 is on a 10-point scale, right? And so I may not be able to truly compare your subjective experience of 5 against someone else's, but I can count on your ability to rate within your experience a rating that will have a somewhat consistent value over time. And then I can look across different individuals to see, are there certain neurotransmitters or brain areas that seem to be more engaged when people are at their
Mm.
relative high point versus their relative low point. And that can still give me some information, even though it can't solve the ultimate question of subjective experience.
So interesting. I mean, I'm just gonna throw some hot shot questions at you because these are things I've always been curious about. Do you feel like on average people feel over the span of a lifetime, if you were to average how much pleasure a person feels, it averages out to similar amounts, regardless of situation?
Well, it's hard to say because I think people have such a range of situations and experiences, and I hesitate to speak about lots of different types of experiences that I don't know very well. What I can point to is an old literature called, going back to the 60s, called the hedonic treadmill, which is this idea a little broader than pleasure, sort of general kind of contentedness or sense of well-being, that people often have the idea that significant life events like marriage or divorce, or a significant injury leading to a kind of permanent loss of an ability, or winning the lottery, for example, that these would have a really meaningful and lasting impact on their sense of well-being. And what data has found that tracks people before and after these types of events is that there's a short-lived, maybe 6 to 18 month lived deflection. So people get happier after they get married for a brief time, and then it kind of returns to baseline. And people may get less happy after a divorce, and then after a year or so, it returns to baseline. And that things that you think will fundamentally alter your sense of well-being forever, um, actually we have a strong sort of homeostatic pull back to whatever our general baseline is like. And so again, I don't know how to really equate experience across individuals, but within an individual, there does seem to be a sort of strong consistency. Um, some reports, I think, do suggest that regardless of circumstances, some people have a predisposition to have an easier time accessing enjoyment and positive affect than others. That's sort of a reflection of kind of certain personality traits. And I would strongly suspect that circumstances would play a role. I mean, we can likely guess that in situations where you feel under constant threat, stress, food insecure, house insecure, at risk of significant loss, that those circumstances can make it more difficult to access pleasure and well-being. Not necessarily for everyone, but certainly on average. And so if those experiences sort of dominate your life, then yeah, probably you will experience less pleasure on average than someone else.
Hmm. I think there's like a few examples that come to mind immediately. One, Brave New World, Viktor Frankl's Man's Search for Meaning, and
Mm-hmm.
then my just a lot of the examples my dad gave throughout my life. My dad grew up in rural India, and he always used to talk about how, like, for his birthday, like the big thing that he'd get was he'd get some new pencils and you'd get a new pair of clothes, and those days were like a really big deal. And there
Mm-hmm.
was a lot of joy that came from that, just from having
Mm-hmm.
these new things. But
Mm-hmm.
now, he's lived in the US for some time, is an engineer, has done relatively well for himself. And those same things give, pencils, like we have so many at home, they're under the couch. We don't, it's not even a thing anymore, to where that baseline of expectation of what I need to feel pleasure has risen so much that I've always been curious if these circumstances really do change our experience of pleasure, or if our expectation of how much we need to feel pleasure simply just changes. And so, is it that we're still feeling the same? And I think all the Brave New World talks a lot, I think, is an excellent example of that, where if you are kind of in this state of numbness that comes from just like having all your needs met at all given times, then all of a sudden nothing really feels good. Where the second the main character was able to leave and feel pain and actually experience suffering, all of a sudden, because it was some feeling at all, he actually felt pleasure from these feelings that you would think shouldn't bring pleasure. And so I'm curious how much of pleasure is actually just like a perspective as opposed to truly like a, you know?
Yes, I mean, and there's good evidence to support that from a couple of different fronts. So the late great psychologist and behavioral economist Daniel Kahneman did some work about 10, 15 years ago showing that in terms of the example you gave of your father, the relationship between uh, material goods and general sense of well-being or happiness, that there was a strong, doing surveys in the United States, there was a strong positive relationship between material wealth and a sense of well-being up until I don't quite remember the exact number, but I think it was somewhere around $60,000 a year. And then after that, the relationship between more money and more happiness sort of fell apart. And I think the interpretation is that when you are really struggling to make ends meet, extra resources are extraordinarily helpful material resources in psychological well-being. Probably because they really contribute to reducing your sense of uncertainty and threat. And it's very difficult. It's not impossible, as the example of Viktor Frankl tells, but very difficult to uh, access pleasure under periods of intense threat. And once you're lifted out of that, then actually more money doesn't really do much for more happiness. So I think I believe that was a PNAS paper back around 2010 or 2011. But that is, I think, a really interesting example from data in this country of the sort of phenomenon you're describing. The second part of what you're describing is also studied in the psychological literature and sometimes referred to as the effort paradox. And what is meant by the effort paradox is the difficulty reconciling the fact that on the one hand, organisms, including humans, tend to avoid effort when they can. We tend to try and find the easier, simpler, faster way to achieve our goals. And this is an observation that's very old in psychology, going back to the 50s, is sometimes referred to as the principle of least effort or the law of least effort. And it's not just humans that show this. Lots of animals show evidence of avoiding effort when there's a less effortful way to accomplish goals. On the other hand, humans and animals often seek out opportunities to expend effort. And so effort is both something that seems to add value or is intrinsically valued, as well as something that is costly to be avoided. And I think you see this playing out a lot in some of the real current conversations around the ways in which technology is so rapidly increasing friction or really increasing the effort required to do things, as exemplified by large language models like ChatGPT, and how that seems to detract from some of the value we potentially place on our work products. There was this great study from MIT a couple of weeks ago, you may have seen, about comparing the experiences of writing essays by oneself versus as compared to a chatbot, where the individuals who used a chatbot really couldn't remember much about the essay that they wrote. And there was clearly this was less a part of what the study directly tested, but there was um, clearly less of a sense of meaning uh, from the project. And I think that as we move further and further in the domain of removing effort requirements to to survive, it is gonna raise complicated questions for how we do find enjoyment and pleasure and satisfaction.
Hmm. I mean, I think this effort paradox is fascinating, especially in schooling. I mean, I think I spent most of my early schooling cheating in every possible way, opportunity, chance, because I was like, I don't want to put any effort. And I find it it's just fascinating that now I'm going back. I'm trying to read every biology book I can. I'm like, I missed out on so much information that I would just love to
Mhm.
know because I'm so curious. And I put all this time and effort in, and that in itself is actually so rewarding. And I feel a lot of pleasure just trying and even just
Mhm.
putting that effort forward actually gives my life so much meaning and it gives me something to do. And, and so it is, I think the effort paradox really does come down to something that I think I'm really curious. What do you think differs between, is it a type of effort? Is it in the outcome itself that changes so that then what you want to put effort to changes? Or what do you think is the difference between the type of effort that you try to avoid versus the type of effort you want to put in?
That's a really interesting question, and I'm not sure we always know the answer.
Hmm.
Um, and I think that's really where the challenge is, because often in the moment, you might choose to prioritize ease or convenience, and then you may look back and regret that choice. Choosing to do something effortful, to follow through with that, I think does require being in a mental space where you are somewhat protected against stress and threats and other demands that are kind of common in modern life. And when there are a lot of external pressures, you might mistake an effort that you would really value as something it's worth to take the shortcut on. And I've been listening to a lot of conversations with educators about what they're seeing with large language models in their classrooms. I myself teach undergrads at Emory University and have struggled with this issue because I do think it really can shortchange the educational experience. I also think it's way too much to ask students to resist the temptation when they're often under a lot of pressure. And students right now are living in a period of unbelievable uncertainty in terms of what institutions will be there for them and what the economy and the nature of work will look like for them when they are trying to build their careers or are mid-career. I think there's a lot of uncertainty right now. And so it's very tempting to use a shortcut to potentially get a better grade. But I also
Hmm.
think there's a real capacity for students to regret it when, you know, a year or two after graduating, they may have the great grade on their transcript, but they can't really say anything knowledgeable about the subject.
And it's so interesting because I think oftentimes, I mean, and I think a big reason of why I cheated for so long is kind of similar to that framing that you just put there, which is the whole point anyone around me went to school was to get into college. There was no
Mhm.
real essence in, there was no value in learning for the sake of learning itself where I grew up. I grew up in the Bay and it was a very competitive environment, and
Mm.
all anyone was thinking about since they were in the fifth or sixth grade. And it's, I mean, I teach now and it's a million times more intense than when I was growing up. And it's just fascinating how, if the goal is only to get into college, if I can cheat and still get into college, then because the end goal is still the same, well, it doesn't really matter. And then once you're in
Yeah,
college, you need to get a job. And well, if I can get a job and you can get a job and you had to try and I had to cheat, well, I just got the same place you got with less effort. And every step of the way, it turns out like that. But I actually just wrote a piece on this, which is I've been writing a lot recently, and one of the biggest things writing has given me, which is not money, which is not all these other things, but it's a sense of meaning and of there. I can't, it's hard to explain that
hmm
feeling when you get to pour your soul and effort into something and
hmm
you care deeply about it, and the creation of the thing itself means so much to you that you would rather not live than to not create the thing. And once writing became that for me, there's no idea of, oh, why don't I just like put a sentence in ChatGPT and let me get a paragraph out of it? Because it's, the whole point of my writing is not any longer for some sort of outcome. It truly is for the process of writing itself. And I feel like with all of these things, the question that's not necessarily being asked is like, why do it at all? And I think in asking that, we might get to a point where we realize that pleasure, for example, can be generated through writing, like with
hmm
no outcome on the other side, just the process of writing itself, the process of sitting there, magically turning a blank piece of paper to something, even if it's not great. The fact that you turned it from emptiness into something is so beautiful. And I think it pains me to see that there's just no kind of conversation really happening around that. And instead people are like, well, if you don't learn how to write, what are you going to do when you get to a job? Which still just
right.
connects, it's still connecting those two, you know?
Yeah, no, I think this is a great point. And I think part of the challenge in having this conversation is we don't really have a great understanding of how this all works. And you're really getting to the heart of the matter, right? So we've all sort of been trained to view our effort in very capitalist terms. My effort is something I have to give, and I should get something in exchange, and I should get the highest market value for my effort as I can. Now, we know that in reality, that's not exactly how people value their time, because there are lots of careers where people get less money than perhaps they could doing something else, but they find some other value in it. That framing still kind of connects effort to the reward you get at the end. And that's actually one of the explanations or proposed hypotheses to try and explain the effort paradox is this idea of what's a theory called learned industriousness. Excuse me. And it's the idea that effort is costly and something you avoid, but because effort often leads to better rewards, you get conditioned over time to learn to associate uh, effort with reward. And that is how it eventually takes on a positive value. And that's one explanation. We don't really know that that works. Um, and there are some wrinkles to the story, particularly as you get into the neuroscience, that make the issue even more confusing.
Hmm.
So, what is effort at the level of the brain?
Now we're talking.
Yeah, you know, we we have certain tasks that most people find very effortful. And we've all had the experience of doing something cognitively demanding that we come away from and feel, wow, that's really effortful. a classic example. There was actually, I believe it was a lab in Germany where in the 30s, the professor wanted to test the limits of cognitive effort and had his grad students do four-digit multiplication problems mentally, just hours and hours on end. I think if I remember correctly, the longest student lasted about 4 days. Um, but what was being tested is it in fact effortful? And the answer was yes. But an interesting question is, well, why? Why should using your brain in that way be so effortful? There are lots of other parts of your brain, including other parts of the cerebral cortex, uh, that are being utilized all the time to process, photons hitting the retina. You spend 12, 16 hours a day looking around and creating this rich three-dimensional representation of the light hitting the 2D surface of the retina, and that never feels effortful. You never
Mm.
feel like too fatigued to see or to process sound. So why is it that processing symbol manipulation you should feel so much more effortful? And that is a challenge that the field is really stuck on in the moment. Is we have a general sense that effort is somehow related to energy expenditure. Um, and we know, for example, that uh, how I expend mental energy will influence my ability to expend energy during physical tasks and vice versa. But we don't have a real understanding as to what is actually the currency of energy expenditure that leads to the sensation of effort.
Mm.
Another
Wow.
explanation to the effort paradox is that effort is, in some sense, intrinsically valuable, and that we have a a tendency to want to expend effort. It's not just I'm willing to expend energy, expend effort when there's a reward attached, but there's some kind of biologic, innate push. And you see this, for example, in certain animals, like mice will engage in wheel running. Um, and that's, if you put a wheel in their cage, and they will do that spontaneously without being trained, beginning very early in life. And there's never any reward associated with it. Um, they just seem to like something about it. And certainly little kids, I have two children. I've seen them both in those first couple of years, and they're moving all the time. As any parent, I think, can tell you, kids don't seem to have an aversion to expending energy at all.
Yeah.
And there's actually been some nice work, including work from Leah Somerville's lab, showing that um, kids, this is more like kids 3 and 4, they don't seem to show a negative response to tasks that require more effort. Um, in the way that if you were trying to be a good capitalist and maximize your reward for your effort, that you should show an aversion to doing more effort when it gives you the same reward.
Mm.
So it seems it may be something that we learn as a way to navigate this particular society, and that can work reasonably well in certain circumstances. Um, but as long as it isn't so pervasive that we lose our ability to understand the value of expending effort at all. I mean, what you described in your discovery, it sounds like, of there's something so powerfully joyous in the act of creating and using your effort to bring something into being, um, that's something we really don't want to lose as an understanding.
Yeah. I'm curious what you think about when we talk about rewards. Let's say I do something because I believe that it will bring me some sort of pleasure either now or, let's say I just finished a book. And let's say I did that because and part of me did because I felt a lot of pleasure and joy in just the process itself. Does that count as doing the thing for a reward where the reward is just the expectation of pleasure?
Does are you asking, does it count even if the reward is in the future?
I
Is
guess what
that
I'm
the
asking
yeah.
is it possible to do anything without the expectation of reward? Like instead of the
Mm.
reward being
Mhm.
something external, what if it's just like how I feel?
Yes, I think those there are lots of rewards that are like that. There's the reward of doing things that sort of align with your values. Um, Even if the thing you're doing isn't particularly physically pleasant, you know. Um, and so
I mean, that's
e-
so interesting, huh?
yeah, yeah,
Like
yeah.
I think people who, for example, it's just so fascinating culturally how I mean, connecting it back to what I've seen in Indian culture, particularly my culture, I don't want to speak for all of India, but it's fascinating because it is so it revolves strongly around community. The amount of sacrifice people make for the greater good of like their family or for their neighbors, whatever, even if it does cause like tremendous pain in the moment to cook for
Hmm.
everyone or whatever it is, where you're like, I
Hmm.
don't want to have this random cousin stay at my house for 3 weeks, but I'm gonna do it. And it's
Hmm.
like, but people still I guess gain some sort of pleasure because they're like, oh, I'm doing good for my family. And so I sometimes wonder how much of pleasure is just a perspective rather than it being anything physical on your body. Is it can a different way of looking at something completely change your actual experience of the thing itself?
Yes, I think that's true. And there have been very one of the drivers, or one of the things that can really lead to a change in perspective, has to do with the concept of what psychologists call prediction error. And prediction error is when you have an expectation of how something's going to go, how good it's going to be, and then it deviates. It's either better or worse than expected. Um, so, yeah, easy example. Let's imagine it's Friday night. You're feeling really tired from the week. You don't want to go out. Friend sort of drags you out with a group of friends. You're not really looking forward to it. And then you end up going and having a great time. And it ended up being much better than you expected. Um, that's what's called a positive prediction error. And if you're really looking forward to something and you get there and it ends up being sort of flat, it's sort of worse than you expected, that's a negative prediction error. And uh, prediction error has a strong impact on how we
Hmm.
feel moment to moment, on
Wow.
how much effort um, we think we put into something. So if I ask you to do a effortful task for 10 minutes and I tell you I'm going to pay you $10, and then at the end of it you do it, you really didn't like it, you're like, that was really effortful, but where's my $10? And I say, hey, guess what, I'm actually giving you $30. Well, that's a big prediction error. That's much more than you expected. And after that, if I ask you, so just by the way, how effortful was that thing you did really? You're probably going to tell me that you remember it being a little less effortful because you got it, it sort of the outcome was so much better than expected.
Mm,
Whereas if I had given you the exact $10 that I had promised and that you had agreed to, you probably would have said it was more effortful.
wow. You know, what's coming to my mind right now, and I wonder if you think this is true. I feel like oftentimes what the education system that's built under whatever the education system that's built either under capitalism or maybe a Western relationship with science is that the goal is to change the outside world. If we are dissatisfied with something, change the thing outside, and as we continuously improve that, we will feel the rewards of our surroundings getting better. But the other perspective is, can we improve the actual perceiver themselves? So, what if it's possible, rather than making faster cars or whatever it is that we feel like we need to improve on, we developed the ability for us to put on different perspectives to constantly be in a state of joy with whatever it is that we currently have. I mean, I think both of those just take two different approaches to pleasure. But
Mhm.
whichever one that you take completely changes how education will be completely built around you,
Yeah, I
right?
think that's true. I think that's true. And certainly there are a lot of traditions. The ones that come most to my mind are the sort of mindfulness-based practices of various Eastern traditions that emphasize not exactly what you're saying, not chasing the desires you feel, not responding to them by trying to change something in the outside world, but rather responding them by changing your own reaction to them and reducing your attachment to them. I mean, this is in a sense gets to what the in Buddhism is the first noble truth that life is suffering, which really is about life is a constant stream of desires, and that desire is a sort of permanent state that can never be satisfied. So don't keep trying to satisfy it. Learn to
Have
live with the discomfort. Yeah, sorry, go ahead.
no, no, I was just wondering, have because this is so fascinating, but have you or has anyone in this space studied how different perspectives change how much pleasure a person is capable of feeling? Because I would assume someone like that is probably a lot more capable of feeling just more pleasure throughout their life.
I think a lot of people believe that is true. I am not aware of really strong study. It's a very hard thing to study because it is uh, hard to do randomized controlled trials with those types of interventions. Now, there have been randomized controlled trials over relatively short periods of time, like 3 to 6 months, with various meditation practices and other mindfulness-based approaches that have found evidence that they can successfully reduce stress to a certain extent. But Western psychotherapies will show somewhat similar magnitudes of improvement. There have also been, studies exploring other perspective changing interventions like gratitude journals, really trying to bring your attention more to things that you appreciate. And those also do seem to have at least a short-lived impact on well-being, leading to improved well-being. But the the longer term longitudinal work, we really don't know. Like,
Mm,
uh, and I think these are just very hard designs to do, and it's of course who wants to sign up to for a randomized study to really commit 10 years of your life um, to see if it improves well-being. So there are limits on the types of studies we can do that would be necessary to definitively answer these kinds of questions.
mm. Yeah. I mean, what does your intuition say, I guess, if not? Because I guess The thing that I'm curious about is the rise of just the mental health epidemic. Or I'm not even sure if you feel like there is one, but from what I've seen, there seems to be one among youth in this country. I'm curious how much of that people point to so many different things, but the one thing I have not heard enough people point to is perhaps just like the mindsets that we all carry in this country itself. People point to social media, people point to, this and that, but it's like I feel like there's certain in my age range, for example, I just recently downloaded Instagram and I know I'm thinning a little bit out in the front, but I have been getting bombarded with ads for men losing hair. And I know a lot of people my
Mm,
age have been feeling that. But there is a possible context where losing hair is very beautiful and glamorized, or whatever. Maybe you lived in a
hmm
world where losing hair was actually completely acceptable and it was a sign of you, the same way as you get taller and it means you're growing, you lose hair and it means you're aging. And maybe
hmm
that's like a beautiful process and it is a perspective. But when you put it in this context of like you're aging, that's sick, you're losing hair, you're no longer attractive, you're blah, then all of a sudden now you are contextually having someone feel this deep sense of like something is wrong with me that doesn't necessarily have to be there. But it seems like we don't talk enough about the perspectives we share as a culture, and we point the blame to all these other things like TV and I don't know.
Yeah, I mean, I do think there are a lot of really unique challenges for kids and young adults right now. And I'm not an expert in social media and its potential for harm, although from what I have seen, I tend to be swayed by the arguments that people like Jonathan Haidt and others are making about the detrimental impact. And there's certainly really is quite compelling correlational data between when uh, subjective reports of mental health in youth begin and the timing of that around 2010 and the rise in social media and smartphone adoption. So I think that that probably plays a role. I think less talked about, relevant for this conversation is there there is an accelerated pace of what is sort of possible or what is expected. And so I've noticed that this is more from my teaching experience, but very few of the undergraduates I teach um, are taking my classes just because they find it interesting. They are often just extremely motivated by checking the box to the next step in their career. And if they also find it interesting, that's really a bonus. But they're very motivated by wanting to make sure they are quote unquote on track. And I'm not quite sure why that is the case, why there's an expectation or a sense of an expectation that things should all stay on track, that there should be a clear linear path. Um, and I do wonder if that's in part a reflection of technology has made things at least appear to be so much easier. Um, but there seems to be a lot less emphasis on trying to cultivate one's enjoyment and pleasure in learning a particular subject. Um, and I do really worry about that as a loss, that as these students grow up and find careers, they may find that they don't really know how to enjoy them.
Hmm. I mean, yeah, I feel really strongly about this particular space, and I think in a lot of ways, education's aims and capitalism aims often don't align at all. where
Mm.
there's not much. It's just really sad because even if you enjoy something, then the answer is, oh, if you enjoy it, then you should do it for work. And then if you enjoy
Hmm.
it, then you can get paid more because you enjoy doing it anyway. But I don't know. Yesterday I was at one of my friends does is a astrochemist in Boston, and she astrochemist at Harvard, and she like for the first time took me to her lab, and I like she and her friend gave me a tour for 2 hours through the entire campus and explained to me about all these tools and things, and I mean I was mind blown, and I was they're
Mm.
really studying the entire conceptions of life, like why is it that life even came to be. And they ask these really complex questions, and they study meteorites and they study other planets from other galaxies, and it's just mind blowing. And they're not paid much, they're not, but they're really at the top of what they do. And I was just mind blown at just how passionate they were. And I was like, you care very deeply about the questions that you're asking, and that gives you a certain sense of fuel to then go into the world with. And the question
Hmm.
is not, and obviously you want to have your needs met, and I mean, that's not to be understated, but the goal is not to reach a state of excess. It is, I need what I need, but then I want to give as much effort as I can into these questions and problems that I find to be very worthwhile exploring. There's a joy that comes from that that I don't think you can explain, but it can only be experienced, you know?
Mm-hmm.
And I think a lot about this with passion. And I'm really curious, have you seen a correlation between passion and pleasure? And first, I'm not really even sure how to define passion, but that because I think there's a whole conversation about like I haven't found my passion yet, or that particular phrase is something that I find to be really interesting. But I think people often feel that there's like one or two things that exist out there, and that's their passion. And when they do it, that's when they feel pleasure. So is there a correlation or connection between a state of being passionate and pleasure?
I think there certainly can be. And, I think this idea of I need to find my passion, I think that as I've heard and participated in that kind of conversation, I think it mistakes what a passion is. I think having a passion for something is a skill that is learned rather than a phenomenon that you stumble into. That like
Yes.
it's not just revealed. You walk into this room where people are, doing this type of painting and it suddenly hits you, oh my God, this is what I've been waiting for, but rather a variety of different motivational sources. Maybe there's a part of you that is doing this because, um, you think your family will approve and because you think it will give you some financial security. And then there's a part of it that's interesting to you. And all these different motivators come together and you start working on it. And then if you pay attention to how you respond to the different aspects of a career. Let's take medicine as example. Um, you may find that, actually, I'm not as moved by biology and I don't necessarily care as much about, making money or status as maybe I thought I did. But wow, I really uh, experience great joy when I help take care of someone, when I have that sort of moment of really easing someone else's suffering. And I think you can develop passions by putting your effort towards something and then watching how the impact of that affects you very closely and really teasing apart what were the aspects of the effort I put into this that actually felt really meaningful and gave me a sense of pleasure versus what are the aspects that didn't.
Hmm. And I mean, and so when I mean, I think I wrote down again, passion is a perspective, and I feel like that is something I really want to. I started writing something about that a few years ago, and I want to come back to that where I really do think passion is something where there's certain things that when it opens, when you understand something about it, I think that's the same thing for sports. I mean, you listen, I love basketball. And so when I watch an NBA game, it means something so different for me than somebody who's just watching for the first time. And that's not because we're
Mhm.
watching two different things, it's because the context in which I understand it allows me to notice things that you just may not notice. And
Mhm.
had you the tools to notice those things, you too would find what's because everything I truly believe is absolutely mesmerizing. I mean, I have never come across something that isn't infinitely complex and infinitely fascinating. I mean, there's nothing out there. It doesn't matter what it is. It's line skating, cup stacking, Rubik's Cube solving, coding, construction, pop making. It just doesn't matter. They're all so complex that if you have somebody who cares deeply about it and can share that kind of perspective of what makes it fascinating to them, I think it brings out that sense of, wow, this is amazing. This is magical.
Yeah.
And so I guess one thing I want to ask you is in relation to mental health, when we think about pleasure's connection to mental health, is it that someone who struggles to feel pleasure ends up feeling more depressed, or is it somebody who's like, in which direction does that connection go? Is it, or is it kind of like a loop where they both influence each other?
I think really all of the above. And this is one of the things that we are really trying to understand better. So, depression was for a long time believed to be really qualitatively distinct and a fairly uniform experience. And it's now understood that depression is not really one disorder, if you want to call it that. It's a family of disorders, much the way cancer isn't one thing, but there are many different types of cancers. And I think that depression can come about um, from either a real difficulty enjoying things that leads to a lack of motivation over time, right? I can't enjoy things, so what's the point? Um, and I think it can also start in the other direction. I feel unmotivated, and even when I enjoy things, I don't look back on them in a way that motivates me to do it again. And more often than not, I would guess it's some combination of both. And what's really interesting about that from the perspective of neuroscience is to the best that we can really know this based on some of the limitations on reporting pleasure, and then particularly if you're trying to do studies in animals who can't necessarily tell you if they're experiencing pleasure, but to the best of our ability, the field has found that motivation for things and apparent enjoyment of things rely on two different neurotransmitter systems.
Hmm.
So, um, this was classically shown by Kent Berridge at the University of Michigan, where he observed that there are certain automatic responses to pleasurable stimuli that mammals share. So if you drop sugar water on a newborn's mouth, it will lick its lips. The same thing is true for a baby monkey, and the same thing is actually true for a rat. So he figured I can use these sort of uh, conserved behavioral reactions as an indicator of pleasure. And he found that if you stimulated opioid projections in the brain, you could kind of increase the amount of sort of mouth licking that a rat would do when you gave it something pleasurable. And if you blocked opioid signaling in the brain, you could knock that down. And opioids, are the target of a lot of drugs in humans that are known to induce very strong pleasurable responses, like morphine and heroin. Um, and conversely, if you manipulated either increased or decreased levels of dopamine in the brain, you wouldn't actually impact these reactions, but you could strongly impact the animal's willingness to work for a reward. So if I have a lever and the animal can press the lever a certain number of times to get a sweet pellet, and I give it a dopamine enhancing drug, it will press the lever a lot more. And if I give
Mm.
it a dopamine blocking drug, it will press the lever a lot less. But when I manipulate dopamine, if I just give the animal the reward, like the sugar water, it will still kind of lick its lips the same. So I can, to sort of sum it all up, I can, by manipulating opioids, I can manipulate how much an animal seems to enjoy something without manipulating how much it's willing to work for it. And by manipulating dopamine, I can manipulate how much an animal is willing to work for something without affecting how much it seems to respond to the reward when it gets it. Now, these
Whoa.
two systems are clearly talking to each other all the time. But to get back to your question of what is happening in depression, we think there's, some sort of complex disconnect in how these systems are interacting. And, importantly, I think that can look very different for different people. Um, and where the field is now is trying to figure out, are there ways we can measure in humans uh, whether the problem is primarily a sort of loss of some dopamine, so they're not feeling motivated anymore? Is it some kind of block within those opioid pleasure circuits? So they're motivated just fine, but something is stopping the ability to experience pleasure when they actually do work for something. And that's kind of this where we are now, is trying to figure out how to identify that at the patient specific level. Because what we do know is it's not one problem that's the same for everyone who's depressed.
Mm. And are there ways to do this without using drugs of some sort?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, we know, for example, that exercise is actually a pretty powerful antidepressant. It's hard to get people to do it, but it is pretty effective. Um, there's a very effective psychotherapy called behavioral activation that's really just all about getting
Mm.
people to do things even when they don't think they'll enjoy them. It's sort of going back to your comment about the importance of perception. When people are depressed, their perception is that their effort won't lead to a reward. There's no point to doing it. And the idea of behavioral activation therapy is really trying to convince people to essentially ignore whether they think it will be rewarding and to just do it. It's in fact sometimes jokingly referred to as the Nike therapy, because the mantra is just do it.
That's funny. I mean, that's so. I feel like the implications of everything that we're talking about are so deep, and I feel like this is just a start for towards a much more. I mean, it's such an important conversation, especially in education. But I want to just say thank you so much for your time and I mean your expertise and everything that you said. I found to be so insightful. So thank you.
Well, it's really been fun. And thanks so much for a lot of great questions.
Yeah, and I mean, I just yeah, this has truly been one of those conversations where I feel like it's been cool. Every episode this season has been bringing up to light something very different. The last episode was on what is creativity and really thinking
Mm.
deeply about
Mhm.
creativity and that's impact and thinking about pleasure and defining what pleasure looks like and defining awe. And these are all things that I think add to some extent what it means to lead a full life, but each one really needs to be questioned deeply and understood because they do have deep ramifications to how we think about education and policy and more broadly speaking. And so thank you for sharing everything.
Well, thank you for having me. It was a great conversation. Appreciate
Yeah.
it.
And that brings us to the end of our conversation. I hope you enjoyed it as much as I did. Thank you again for listening and making this process so much more enjoyable. If you haven't had the chance to already, make sure to subscribe to the podcast on Spotify, Google, and Apple Podcasts to get the latest updates on new episodes. If you've been learning useful information here, feel free to leave a review as well. A little bit goes a long way in spreading this podcast. And have a wonderful day. And as per usual, stay re-educated.